I'm Chuck Haas from Drexel University. I'll be moderating the session. The way in which we've organized this, we'll first have Dr. Casagrande go over some particular questions that we posed with reference to the work that you heard talked about this morning that Griffin did under his direction. Then we have 3 comments. We've changed the order of the comments a little bit. Tony Cox will start off, then Kara Morgan, finished by Adam Finkel. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have a goodly amount of time for questions. And what I'd like to do for the question period is we'll alternate between 2 mics, taking 1 question at a time for however many we can take until the end of the session. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Casagrande to talk about lessons from the risk-benefit assessment.
Well, I'd like to thank the Academy of Science for inviting me here today and to provide an opportunity to discuss some of the lessons we learned in the conduct of the risk and benefit assessment and also address some of the questions posed to me by the panel. So just very briefly, I'll go over the risk and benefit assessments, the salient points that were made, as well as some of the subtle changes that have been made from the draft that was presented at the last NSABB meeting to the final, which will be posted at the end of the month. Talk about the lessons we learned and some data gaps we encountered during the conduct of the risk and benefit assessment. And then 2 of the specific questions addressed to us were how the risk and benefit assessment could be applied to specific experiments that might be proposed in the future. And then, as many of you who are following this debate know, our choice of using the 1918 influenza strain as one of the comparators has been the subject of much discussion. So I'd like to add some additional comments on that. So just as a reminder, the purpose of our 8-month study was to provide data on the risks and benefits associated with research on modified strains of the influenza viruses and coronaviruses, and that was broken into 3 tasks, each of which was completely distinct as far as the data that was collected and the analysis that was conducted. One was a quantitative biosafety risk assessment. The second, which actually had 2 components, was a biosecurity risk assessment, and the last was a benefit assessment. And as I said, the assessment was comparative. It was to determine the change in risk from pathogens, from research on gain-of-function pathogens compared to research on wild-type pathogens, and also the change in benefits. The benefit assessment was also comparative insofar as what is the benefits of gain-of-function research compared to its alternates. Just very briefly, some of the most salient points. One of the points was trying to address the public discussion that conflated an accident in a laboratory or mishap in a laboratory with a global pandemic. And we tried to suss out all of the individual steps that are required to get from one to another. So a mishap occurs, a spill, a breach in a glove, etc. Then someone had to become infected. Then that person had to either be unaware that they were infected or breach isolation protocols and mix with the general population and successfully infect others. Those others had to infect many in the community, and the infection had to escape local control and then cause an outbreak. And at each step, even for very contagious pathogens like a pandemic influenza strain or like a seasonal influenza strain, the chance that it proceeds to the next step is not assured. This is the summary that we provide of where risk adheres across the various modifications. In yellow, we show some of the changes from the assessment that was published in December. And those were the changes happened based on some data that was pointed to us by Kanta Subaru in the last NSABB meeting, some recent data that showed quite a high degree of cross-protection afforded by exposure to the 2009 influenza against the 1918 influenza. When we incorporated those data, it took some epidemiological calculations that will provide a little bit additional length to the risk assessment. But when we incorporated that, we found that the 1918 influenza wouldn't be as transmissible as we initially thought. which then implies if one were to make it more transmissible or to have it evade this immunity, that would increase its risk. So essentially the pandemic influenza virus, the experiments that are of concern of pandemic influenza virus mirror those of seasonal influenza virus, which we'll get to one of our lessons learned in the future, but further underscore the decision by the NSABB to focus on those phenotypes. Specifically, here's an example of some of the data. If you look at the median global deaths that would occur should a global pandemic be sparked by 1918 influenza, the high degree of protection afforded by exposure to the recent 2009 influenza actually reduces global deaths by about a factor of 1,000 compared to a strain that would be completely antigenically novel, or which the population would be completely naive. So, therefore, in making a 1918 influenza that is antigenically distinct from the wild type one could increase risk significantly. The other interesting thing about this is the 1957 H2N2 pandemic strain then becomes the most risky strain because it would cause about 100 times more global cases because of its antigenic profiles, while it's only 1/10 as deadly than the 1918 strain. And the riskiest modified strain is a 1918 H1N1 strain that's modified to evade residual immunity simply because it has such a high case fatality rate. So once again, all these changes just further serve to reinforce the phenotypes focused on by the NSABB. So some of the other salient conclusions were that manipulating gain-of-function seasonal influenza strains at BSL-3 may compensate for the increase in risk posed by the modified strains, basically by decreasing the risk of a laboratory-acquired infection in the first place. And that's essentially mostly by providing an extra system of respiratory protection. Also, we do highlight several experiments that could pose a risk theoretically, but many of them may not be achievable, or many of them may not have scientific merit. For example, a strain that can overcome protective vaccination increases risk only if it can evade vaccine protection via immune modulation, not by shifting the antigenicity profile of the pathogen. Once again, the scientific value of that experiment might be questionable. The scientific value of increasing the transmissibility of influenza virus beyond that of the most transmissible strains, or increasing the final titer beyond 1 × 10⁸ PFU per mil, is questionable and also perhaps infeasible. There's no model of transmission for the coronaviruses, so manipulation of this trait is not currently achievable. And also, some have contended in some of the comments we've received that SARS-CoV is much more transmissible than we modeled in the baseline, and so further manipulation of that wouldn't have any risk. When we're looking at the biosecurity risk assessment, some points are worth making or repeating. That the traits that drive biosecurity risk are the same as those that drive biosafety risk, and that's because once the incident occurs and there are infections in the population, the probability that the outbreak would escape local control are driven by the same phenotypes. The other important point is these biosecurity events seem to involve the covert infection of the public, meaning that there isn't an opportunity for isolation protocols and health monitoring protocols that are implemented on laboratory workers to curtail the risk of an outbreak. And so these biosecurity events, were they to occur and infect someone, have a greater risk of sparking a global pandemic. Because of that, the biosafety risk we contend, the biosecurity risk we contend should be given as much weight, if not potentially more so, than biosafety risk, because each individual event that involves an infection has a greater chance of becoming a global pandemic. And I want to emphasize here that the biosecurity events that we are talking about, the ones that we think are high risk because they are probable and consequential, aren't that someone would purloin the strains and create a weapon and intentionally infect the public, but that other nefarious events would occur, such as workplace violence, theft, stealing infected animals for animal welfare purposes, these types of events that we see happening again and again in laboratories throughout the US are the ones that would drive the biosecurity risk. On the information risk, we found that minimal information risk remains for gain-of-function studies in the influenza viruses because the dual-use methods that would create more contagious or more deadly or both pathogens have already been published. There is significant information risk remaining for gain-of-function studies in the coronaviruses, but these studies are hampered by a lack of model systems. So the bottom line here is that if we were to look at studies where the publication itself could be used to generate information that would be leveraged by someone who has the intent to intentionally create a very dangerous virus, that there's minimal information risk remaining for influenza and that we don't have the tools to leverage the information risk yet for the coronaviruses. The other important point in the information risk section is that any information risk that exists in the influenza and coronaviruses is not unique to those pathogens. We describe several other types of pathogens that could be manipulated to create similar risks of modified strains. And lastly, in the benefit analysis, I recommend that anyone who is very interested in this field read the longer version of the benefit analysis that's there because the devil is in the details. However, we have identified several fields of, several benefits arising from gain-of-function research that have significant advantages over the alternatives. The exact nature of those benefits, depends on the exact experiments that are being conducted, and that's all described in the benefit assessment. All right, so moving to the charge that we were given, what were the lessons learned in the gaps? There were several lessons we learned during the executions of the risk and benefit assessment. For the sake of time, I'm going to talk about the top four, and I'll talk about them in order. The first was something we noticed during the conduct of the RBA, but then was driven home by the final pieces of data that were highlighted by Dr. Subaru, which was that there's really an artificial distinction between seasonal and pandemic influenza strains when we're dealing with biosafety risk. And by that, I mean that, the discussion thus far and the discussion of these two strains has been distinct, or these two types of pathogens has been distinct, largely because public health and policy stakeholders often compartmentalize pandemic and seasonal influenza strains because they have very different risks when they first emerge. However, after emergence, the pandemic strains contribute to the population of seasonal influenza strains in the following years, and today's H1N1 strains of seasonal influenza many of them are descendants of the original 1918 strain. So the interesting thing is, and something that we learned during the conduct of this risk and benefit assessment, is that the risk from a laboratory accident or a biosecurity incident with an older pandemic strain must be understood in the context of the non-naive population. Although all the data we have, all the epidemiological data we have from these strains is largely from those initial outbreaks. So distinguishing that one pool of data, that very robust data we have, and modifying it to account for our non-naive population is actually pretty tricky, but one thing that we did in this final version of the report. And anyway, there's no bright line between these strains, between the seasonal and old pandemic strains, so risk is best understood as a single continuum. We have pandemic strains with case fatality rates that are about that of seasonal influenza, and transmissibility about that of seasonal influenza. So the distinctions begin to disappear. So all it does is create these artificial boundaries and additional complexity to any study without adding a lot of benefit. And I want to point out that although it makes sense to consider them as one continuum for examining older pandemic strains that have emerged in the past and are being studied currently, it's not true for risk and benefit assessments that look at the risk of emergence. Should a new pandemic strain evolve in nature for which we have no immunological experience, then that should be analyzed as a completely distinct thing. The other thing that hampered our study was a lack of data on human reliability assessment in life sciences laboratories. And we had data from other industries that demonstrated quite clearly that most failures in safety equipment are due to human ignorance, carelessness, or neglect. It's not mechanical failures that are driving these accidents that occur. As an example here, faulty pappers are produced much more rarely than sound pappers are poorly worn, poorly assembled, or poorly maintained by the personnel that are using them. Moreover, when we look in the life sciences laboratories, most mechanical failures that occur are accompanied by some signal that a human worker has to ignore, misunderstand, or intentionally override, all of which have occurred, to create a dangerous situation. Mechanical failure by itself is not sufficient. Additionally, in the life sciences enterprise, unlike the nuclear, chemical, or transportation sectors, mechanical failures by themselves aren't sufficient to cause an accident. In general, the accidents that we see occurring that lead to infections in life sciences laboratories, there's a human error that initiates them. The most common accidents that we see that drove infection risk were slips, spills, misuse of centrifuge, and cuts. Whereas it's not just pipes failing that cause a breach in a chemical plant, for instance. So despite the importance of human factors in driving the risk of accidents, we found extremely little data on human factors and their relationship to accidents and infections in the life science enterprise. We did find some data on animal bites and how human practices influence the frequency and severity of animal bites in laboratories, but that's about it. So our risk and benefit assessment had to analogize from human reliability data from other industries to activities in the laboratory. Someone misreading a dial on an airplane or in a nuclear power plant, misreading a dial on an autoclave, for instance. And this shortcoming prevented an evidence-based and rigorous assessment of absolute risk, as was pointed out by Dr. Stanley. We didn't have enough data to use our probabilistic risk assessment to say how often a spill would occur such that an infection would happen, because we don't know how often when someone's using a microtiter plate, the pipette tip skips over the top of the well and sprays them. We don't have those data. We don't know when someone is doing a necropsy using scissors to cut open a mouse, how often they slip and breach their gloves such that it causes an infection risk versus how often they just drop the scissors, for instance. So this shortcoming prevented an absolute risk assessment from being created that was actually evidence-based and defensible. And I think, though, this shortcoming, looking forward into the future to kind of improve biosafety analysis that's undertaken, this shortcoming is addressable by primary research. Primary research on human factors in the life sciences laboratories must be conducted to fill this data gap. And we've seen this research conducted in very extensive studies that were undertaken in the transportation, nuclear, and chemical industries, which seem to have much less total possible consequences. We're talking about a nuclear power plant accident. The risks or the consequences from that are certainly dire, but they don't match that of a potential global pandemic. So the lack of investment in human factors research in the life sciences is something that definitely need to be addressed. And that would help any risk and benefit assessment in the life sciences going forward. We found the lack of a risk benchmark difficult to deal with in our risk and benefit assessment. And I think that was echoed in a lot of the comments that you've heard already this morning and probably will hear later on going forward. Our study focused on the change in risk posed by the manipulation of a wild-type pathogen into something else, and we highlight how much risk increases for particular manipulations. However, that increase is sometimes from a low level. So, for example, increased virulence or tighter and attenuated strains. We could say the risk of an accident or of a global pandemic from the wild-type pathogen is 10-fold or 100-fold or 1,000-fold higher, but is that sufficient to make it into a category that requires additional oversight? So for instance, given Dr. Stanley's comments this morning, does that allow the strain to cross into the moderate category or the high-risk category? Sometimes we found that the risk of a pandemic increases to a level posed by any wild-type strain. and that's what we highlighted in our risk assessment as well. However, most of the time for the manipulations that we found, pandemic risk increases, but to a level much less than that posed by the worst pandemic strain, which we're now considering the 1957 H2N2 strain. So still, we have that problem of a lack of a bright line. So does it make sense to continue suspending funding of research that creates new risky strains while continuing funding research on wild-type pathogens that pose more pandemic risk? Does it matter if the non-manipulated strains were created by nature? So for instance, if you're just creating a new strain that has more risk than the wild-type strain, does it matter if you're working on a wild-type strain that has extremely high risk, that nature created? Does it matter if nature created it once but is now extinct? So SARS-CoV no longer exists in nature, and also neither does 1918. Does that matter? Should that be considered? And in the absence of agreed-to risk benchmarks for wild-type strains, absolute or relative risk metrics for any manipulated strain we found difficulty in interpreting our studies. Once again, in a relative risk, we could state that risk increases 100-fold. We could even say risk increases to more than any wild-type pathogen or any particular wild-type pathogen. But the so what is difficult to say without an agreed-to benchmark saying this much risk is acceptable and this much risk is not acceptable. Also, I think if you listen to the debate that has occurred to this point on gain-of-function research and on the pathogen research enterprise, a lot of that debate seems to be people talking past each other about whether they basically agree that the risk of working on wild-type pathogens is acceptable simply because nature created them, versus those that don't agree that that is true. And I think you see a lot of speakers talking past each other based on that baseline assumption that they disagree on. Lastly, our risk and benefit assessment, the quantitative part at least, was restricted to the influenza viruses and the coronaviruses. The information risk section had to look more broadly because a hostile actor, an intelligent adversary, is free to choose whichever pathogen they want to achieve their ends. And in this information risk section, we identified that manipulations of pathogens other than the influenza and coronaviruses could pose similar levels of pandemic risk if it was driven by someone with nefarious intent. The remainder of our study, though, examined just one component of potential pandemic risk, just those particular pathogens, the full suite of which should be considered as part of a comprehensive risk and benefit assessment. And the risk and benefit assessment should provide a set of benchmarks that look at the highest tolerable risk of working with pathogens that currently exist versus ones that are extinct or could evolve, like notional pathogens, theoretical pathogens. I think it makes sense to have two sets of benchmarks there, but that's a policy decision. Also, how risk tolerance might change given different containment levels. So what's acceptable to be done at BSL-3, BSL-3 enhanced, and BSL-4. For the second question that was posed to us was how the risk and benefit assessment would be applied to specific experiments. And that's because, as was made clear this morning, decision makers might be asked to evaluate the risk and benefits posed by specific experiments either in grant proposals or in institutional reviews. I think both were posited in the discussion this morning. The good news is that our risk and benefit assessment, I've often described it essentially as an encyclopedia. It's not, there's no conclusions at the end, it's just a set of data that shows how risk changes and where benefits in here. So it can be used broadly going forward by those struggling with these decisions. To understand the benefits, I don't have it on the slide because it's pretty easy. You go to the relevant benefits section and look at the discussion that's going on there and what are some of the arguments that have made in support of some of these benefits, what are some of the alternatives that should be considered, what are their relative strengths and weaknesses, and that would be a great starting off point because it's a broad review already at 500 pages or so. It's a broad review of the topic. Additional data for the specific manipulation being proposed would need to be brought in, but it's a pretty good starting point there. To understand risk, once again, I think the nature of the task here is to understand the potential risk or reasonable anticipated risk. One of the commenters this morning brought up the excellent point that science is interesting because it's unpredictable. It's potential that you might think you would increase the transmissibility or the pathogenicity of a virus, but find out that you've attenuated it accidentally due to the manipulation that occurred. But still, if the intent is to see what's driving transmissibility or pathogenicity, if the intent is to create a strain that's more pathogenic, that's a reasonably anticipated change. So the first step is to identify the strain that's worked on and to describe its properties that are relevant to pandemic risk. Those properties were talked about this morning in the NSABB policy. Then to understand how the proposed experiment could alter any of these properties. Once again, science is interesting because it's unpredictable, but what is the reasonably anticipated change? And then, using our section 6.6 in the RBA, examine how the proposed change could affect the probability of an outbreak escaping local control. And then section 6.7, how that would affect global consequences. So how probability of an outbreak becoming a pandemic, and also the consequences should it become a pandemic. And then in a very simple way that should be done by any reader, or excuse me, could be done by almost any reader of the risk and benefit assessment, simply multiply these two factors together to obtain what I would say a perspective on the change in risk. I'm not going to say you should stick to that number because it's a very simplistic way to interpret the risk and benefit assessment, but it's something to give you kind of an idea. So for some examples, I think the examples might be illustrative here. So we provide an experiment, what's the risk posed by experiments that include virulence factors from 1918 H1N1 influenza into a 2009 H1N1 strain. So we know that the 2009 strain wasn't that pathogenic compared to the 1918 strain, approximately equivalent to a seasonal strain. So this experiment could be reasonably interpreted to possibly increase the virulence. In section 6.6, it's clear that changes in virulence doesn't increase the probability that an outbreak escapes local control, which makes sense. And in section 6.7, we find that the global consequences scale linearly with case fatality rates, basically, which makes sense. The more infections you have, if that doesn't change, and the more likely an infected person is to die, the more the consequences increase. Also, because the case fatality rate of 1918 influenza was so high and that of 2009 was so low, there's a lot of room for increase. So potentially consequences, global consequences, could increase by several orders of magnitude. And then the simplistic way of interpreting this, since probability is unchanged and consequences could increase by several orders of magnitude, risk could also increase by several orders of magnitude. It's a very qualitative way to use the quantitative assessment that should be accessible to most users. Another example, it's what's the risk posed by experiments that aim to create anagenically distinct strains of a recently circulated seasonal influenza strain. So section 6.6 has graphs like you see on the right side at the top that show that anagenically distinct strains have a 2 to 3 fold increase in risk of escape of local control. So if you have at least one person mingling in the public, if it's completely anagenically distinct from a seasonal strain that has somewhat recently circulated, that risk of it becoming a global pandemic increases 2 to 3 fold. Section 6.7 shows that anagenically distinct strains may inflict 10-fold more global deaths, which is obvious. If people have already been exposed in previous flu seasons to this strain, they're going to be a lot less susceptible to infection, and they're also going to be a lot less likely to transmit that infection to others. Changing the antigenic properties of a seasonal influenza virus could increase the consequences by 10-fold. And so, once again, taking a simplistic approach of just multiplying probability and consequences together, an increase in probability and consequences together, suggests that risk might increase by roughly 20 to 30-fold via this manipulation. Now, there's a number of caveats here. One is that we don't know what a lab accident with a seasonal influenza strain looks like. We don't know if the illnesses caused by the accident with seasonal influenza would supplement or supplant the infections from the next year. We don't know if this outbreak would even be noticed, for instance. So there's a number of issues. But most importantly, once again, we don't know if this increase, even though it's more than an order of magnitude probably, puts this strain into the category of danger. If it makes it, if the change from an R0 of 1.2 to 1.6 changes its category from moderately transmissible to highly transmissible, or if the increase in global deaths by 10-fold from a low level compared to a pandemic strain, this is, we're only talking about a million global deaths total compared to more than 100 million for the most dangerous pandemic strains. Is that sufficient to be considered high risk? We can just point to an increase in the risk and benefit assessment. This slide basically says what I just said with the additional point that does it matter if work's going on down the hall on a wild type pathogen that poses a greater level of risk compared to this manipulated seasonal influenza strain, let's say. The relative risk information that we give, I think, is still pertinent and still sufficient to state that more controls or measures should be taken to control infection risk on this modified pathogen than the wild type pathogen. I think those types of decisions could be made definitely at the institutional level. So I think that is still strong, but in the absence of the overall benchmarks, in the absence of having a line about, well, yes, this 100-fold increase in risk puts it into the high risk category, making broader decisions might be difficult. Lastly, I think a lot of bench researchers we talk to might not be familiar enough with the epidemiological properties of pathogens that they could properly characterize their strains by like assigning them case fatality rates or transmissibility values for the wild type pathogens. So one thing that would help are some guides or tools to easily obtain parameter values for those wild type strains, and perhaps a tool that helps them just make the calculations. And lastly, and I think I still have about 5 minutes, I'd like to address the use of the 1918 H1N1 strain as the comparator. And I want to say the comparisons, the use of this comparator is only in our brief summary, in our executive summary, and in the little 10-page or so summaries of each of the sections that then go on for 100 pages. The rest of the 100 pages don't use any comparators. We just show how the change in any property affects risk. We needed some kind of benchmark to basically quickly summarize 100 pages of results in a couple of pages. One thing that we heard from the public comments and we're changing is that we are going to provide more comparators in the summaries. We're not just going to use 1918 H1N1 anymore. There'll be others that people can choose as other comparators. And once again, 1918, because of the data highlighted for us in the last meeting, won't be the highest risk anymore because of pre-existing immunity. The point is made, though, that we chose this comparator because at the time there was limited discussion, there was some discussion, but limited discussions of a funding moratorium on work on wild-type versions of the 1918 pandemic strain. So we chose this because at the time we were thinking it was the most risky strain. So it would be decided as a reasonable benchmark as maximum allowable risk. If there's no moratorium on work on this, then that's a good benchmark for maximum allowable risk. That's why we chose it. However, if you pick other strains, I think you could find different levels of risk. We have a new comparator, as I said, the 1957 H2N2 pandemic strain. Its initial transmissibility is likely 1.7, slightly less than that of the 1918 strain when it broke out. There's low residual immunity against H2 strains in the public right now. We estimate that the 1918 H1N1 strain, given the data that was shown to us from animal models, if we extend that to an epidemiological modeling, we predict that its R0 right now is around 1.2. Which is on the low end of seasonal strains. The case fatality rate of this strain is about 0.5%, a little bit less, compared to up to 5% for the 1918 strain, and everything else is similar. So if we use this H2N2 strain as our comparator, and as I said, we'll provide several in the final version of the risk assessment, we find that increases in transmissibility don't increase risk very much. So if you're already at an R0 value of 1.7, increasing that even further barely influences risk. That's shown in many of the figures in 6.6 and 6.7. It's possible, since we have examples of pandemic influenza strains where the case fatality rate was several percent, that one could increase risk by increasing its pathogenicity by a factor of 10 or more, given that there's some room there, some historical evidence that there is room there for increasing pathogenicity, whereas the other parameters don't influence risk. So once again, if H2N2 is the only comparator, then transmissibility drops out because you can't increase it, or increasing it from a high level doesn't matter, whereas pathogenicity still is important. We could use any strain we wanted to as a comparator, but it's arbitrary. Given that there's no benchmarks, no bright lines, we could pick a strain and show that if it poses more or less risk than wild-type MERS-CoV or 1968 flu or even poliovirus or God knows what. We could pick whichever comparators we liked. And it doesn't necessarily help inform the policy discussion. What I think is helpful is all of the data we provide on exactly how risk increases from a relative level as you manipulate any of the phenotypes. That helps policymakers focus on what are the phenotypes of concern and how much space there is for increasing risk. Also, I think it's helpful to determine if additional safety and security measures are needed compared to wild-type pathogens. But importantly, it can't be used to determine necessarily if risks are worth the benefits overall. And once again, the sensible comparators are benchmarks for the riskiest allowable research for existing or novel pathogens, potentially 2 different benchmarks, at particular containment levels. And these benchmarks, I think, should be applied regardless of the pathogen being studied, regardless of it's influenza or the coronaviruses, whatever the pathogen might be. And I think that ended the comments. I just wanted to say that, as always, the risk and benefit assessment is posted on our website, including, I mean, if you think the main text is long, there's about 1,000 pages of additional supplemental information that's there. And that's also one of the places where you'll be able to find the revised version when it comes out. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first commenter will be Tony Cox of Cox Associates.
Thanks for a great presentation of a lot of information in a hurry. It's quite useful. I think it's helpful to divide the information that we're getting this morning and background information into 2 big chunks. One has to do with what I think of as risk assessment, which addresses the question, how big is the risk? And Rocco suggested, for example, that sometimes how big the risk that's created by a change might be found by multiplying together the change in probability that could occur and the change in consequence that could occur. Of course, if 0 change in either of those could occur, you wouldn't necessarily want to think that the risk is 0. So it's possible that something other than multiplication, for example, addition over multiple scenarios, might be useful. But the idea that we can at least put some numbers around, well, how many people are at risk and risk of what, fatalities or something else, is quite useful. The other big chunk of information would be, what should we do about it? That's what I think of as the risk management piece. And if we're uncertain about what the size of the risk is, we still may have some clarity about what to do about it. And in the few minutes I have, I want to look at the question of what to do about risk in the context of particular proposals for funding that come in. I'd like to begin by this risk management focus by warning against a couple of things that I think are fallacies. One is, if somebody says, what is the maximum tolerable risk or what is acceptable risk, it's a little bit like asking, what's the maximum acceptable price? If I said to you, what is the maximum acceptable price, you might very well say to me, well, Tony, price of what? What are we talking about here? And if I say, what is the maximum acceptable risk? Is it 1 times 10 to the minus 6th. You might say, well, risk from what? What are the benefits that we're talking about? What are the costs of reducing the risk? I've often thought myself that there's no such thing as an acceptable risk if you could get rid of it for free. I mean, why carry it? So we really have to look at costs and risks and benefits in combination to have a meaningful statement. Another area where I would urge caution, another fallacy actually, is what's called arbitrary coherence by some behavioral economists. It's the idea that, well, look, we're already accepting this, and that is smaller than this, so shouldn't we accept that? By no means. The question is, do we have an attractive risk-cost-benefit comparison? Is there something better that we could do instead? So the idea of using benchmarks or using existing or past scenarios might lead us towards enshrining a bias towards the status quo or the past quo. In a way, it's got nothing to do with rational decision-making. Rational decision-making says, well, all the things we can do, which is most attractive. So let me put up for consideration first a list of questions. The charge given to some of us commentators was to try to say something useful about how to decide what to do on whether or not to fund a new proposal. And I think any such consideration will be enormously informed by the information the Rocco presented. But that information alone, of course, stops short of saying, well, so how are we going to figure out what to do? So rather than saying anything useful on this first slide, I'm just going to give you a list of questions that I think can help to think productively about almost any kind of risk management decision. So the first and least good question is, do the potential benefits of a proposed project outweigh its potential risks? That could be useful as a screening question. Let me say up front that there's not necessarily an objective answer. Risks and benefits don't necessarily have commensurable units, and they do necessarily have subjective components. What I mean by that is if I give you 2 probability distributions and say which one is better, decision analysis teaches us that in general, there's no answer to that question. In general, you need to know the risk attitude of the person making the decision. You need to know something about trade-offs. But sometimes, as in the colorful picture that I've pasted from Google Images up there, sometimes it's clear that one probability distribution lies to the right of another, and in that case, everybody who prefers more to less, or in the case of fatalities, prefers less to more, ought to agree on which is better. A more useful question than this screening question is the second question. Can we do something to improve the risk-benefit profile of the project that's been submitted? I'm going to skip over number 3, who should decide, but I'll note that it's very important. The BugSat model, a bunch of guys sitting around a table, is not necessarily legitimate or acceptable to all stakeholders. So there are great questions that have been, I think, sensitively addressed already by this committee on what constitutes a legitimate decision process. The thing that I find most interesting is 4. How should we decide? And here I want to mention the concept of a decision rule. A decision rule is something that as input takes all the information that's available, however lousy that might be. It says, okay, here's the information. And as output, it makes a decision. For example, fund this, given that information, or say, no, we're not going to fund it, given that information, or temporize, say, well, we might fund it, but we need more information. And if that more information is favorable, then we might fund it. So mapping available information to a decision, that's what I mean by a decision rule. And there are different forms of decision rules. A useful thing, I think, to consider is what decision rules do we want to use? This is a little bit of a different question from what decision should we make in an individual case. Here comes a project. You're in charge. What do? Do you accept it? Do you reject it? Or do you say, I need to see some changes or get more information? Rather than answering that question one decision at a time, I think it may be more productive to say, what decision rule do we want to use that when it's applied over a population of cases tends to have pretty good performance, and we can't find anything else that is better performance. So that concept, I'm doing 2 things, and I only have 3 minutes left to do them. One is to say, what are the questions that we should be asking? And this slide is an attempt to list some questions for focusing good decision-making on a risk management problem. And then the other is not what questions should we be asking, but what answers should we be giving. And where I'm headed is with the idea, well, if we have enough information of the type that's already in the risk-benefit analysis report to simulate the performance of decision rules, then we should do that, and we should find the rules that work best. So that's, in a nutshell, where I'm going. Okay, question number 5 is, when should a decision be made? And what's going on here is it's worth asking, should we collect more information before making a funding commitment one way or another? I would contrast this point of view, which says how much information do we need and what does the information need to say before we can determine whether this is the best option available to us. I would contrast that first with how much information do we need to decide whether the benefits outweigh the costs according to somebody's system of values. And I would contrast it especially with, are we above or below an acceptable risk threshold? I think that the acceptable risk threshold is a lousy way of making decisions because it leaves out the trade-offs about risks, costs, benefits, other options, opportunity costs. Speaking of opportunity costs, there's a different kind of cost to waiting, or perhaps benefit from waiting, which comes from the collective or social aspect of decision-making here, which is, if not us now, maybe somebody else now, or maybe somebody else later. Who else is going to be doing this research and when, and are they going to share the results? It seems to me that the answers to those questions, looking at the social aspect, or if you're an analyst, the game theoretic aspects of research, put a very different light on should we fund this now. If we don't fund it now, maybe somebody will do it first. Is that good or bad? If they do it first and publish the results and bear most of the risks, it might be a good thing to wait. On the other hand, if they'll discover something that we really wish that we'd done first, then it might be a bad thing to wait. My point in raising this question is just to focus from an emphasis on, is this above or below a certain line called maximum tolerable risk? That's a bad way of doing things, I think, to what are the trade-offs involved in postponing a decision or making a decision sooner or making different kinds of decisions. Lastly, how good was our decision? We put all this thought into it. We tried to ask the right questions. We tried to do the right thing. We made a decision. Was it a good decision? We should set up, and the concept of adaptive risk management has already come out several times in the committee's deliberations, but we should try to make sure that we learn from experience. Too often, if you don't think about that, you don't do it. Okay, I'm about out of time, so I'll put up a slide and say nothing about it, other than if you understand the situation well enough to simulate a bunch of cases, then in the privacy of your simulation model, you can try to work out what decision rules are most productive, averaged over a population of cases. Possibly this would be a useful way forward. Possibly not. It depends on whether we have enough knowledge to be able to do useful simulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Our second discussant will be Kara Morgan from Battelle.
So my first comment is that Tony and I have a lot of consistency in our presentations, but we use a slightly different lens. So maybe some of his comments resonated with some folks, maybe some of mine will resonate with others, but I wanted to make that comment because it might sound different because of the way I talk about it, but there's actually a lot of consistency. The other thing I wanted to mention is Chuck and Adam and Tony and I are all colleagues from the Society for Risk Analysis, but a lot of what we're talking about today also really connects to the Decision Analysis Society, and Tony mentioned decision analysis as a tool. Really, we were asked to talk about how to link the analysis that was done, the risk and benefit analysis, to policymaking, and that is really about decision making, right? So you're taking technical information, using it to make decisions, and so in that sense, the decision analysis community is one that has a lot of relevance here as well. So the research in decision making, I'm not sure how many of you are kind of familiar with this area, and I know a lot of you are working in the government, but also, kind of more on the pure science side. And there's actually been decades of work in the area of how to make decisions. And a lot of it was driven by situations like this, complex science and technology, lots of uncertainties, multiple stakeholders, really important conflicting objectives, maybe conflicting values, situations where you might have severe, significant outcomes, but with a low probability. Those all make for a situation that it's really hard to make decisions about. And the analysis is an important part of that, but I'm going to talk kind of more broadly about the decision tools that have been developed to help in exactly those kind of situations, because I think it's very relevant here. So I'm going to talk about 3 different decision frameworks, you might call them. Tony referred to them as decision rules, and at the risk of sounding too academic, it's really very practical. It's deciding how to decide. And I think that's part of maybe what's missing in some of these discussions. I heard a lot of the comments today talked about different decision models, but since you guys aren't from that field, generally maybe you don't even know that you're talking about different decision models, and that creates more conflict. So I want to just kind of lay out 3 frameworks, but really making the point that there's not really 3 distinct frameworks. They're kind of points on a continuum, and there's a lot of adaptation that can be made to any of these frameworks to fit this particular situation, any particular situation. And I also wanted to mention that there could be a tiering of these frameworks, so you might have one framework or decision rule that you use initially to do some screening, to separate off some things that you take into a higher level. We heard some comments this morning about analysis kind of fitting the complexity. So you don't want to do overly complex analysis if you don't need to. So we can use a tiering approach and apply different decision rules. In that way, some decision rules that might be oversimple for some cases might be perfectly fine for other cases. So I'm going to talk about that in these 3 frameworks. So the first one we've heard a bit about today already. This is really the most simple and therefore very appealing decision rule, and it's still used in a lot of risk assessment contexts today. And in situations, so this fundamentally is a decision about what level is acceptable in whatever metrics you're using to determine risk, whether it's mortality rate or it could be a qualitative continuum. It's just a matter of saying we know that this is the place at which things switch to being unacceptable. So everything lower than that is fine, and everything greater than that is not fine, or maybe leads to another more complex decision rule. So like I mentioned, this is very appealing. It's really easy to implement, incredibly transparent, very easy to understand for folks that are not involved in the decision. You ideally would incorporate in your estimates of those points on the line what the risk is. You would be incorporating your risk management options. So in situations where there's a lot of agreement on kind of the effectiveness of those risk management options to address risk, this is, again, a very appealing tool to use. One of the things that's happened historically in the use of this decision rule is the acknowledgement that there's always uncertainty in science. And so there might be some studies that lead you to say, okay, the line is here, it's at 2, whatever your metric is. But we know that future studies might give us more information, so we're gonna add some safety factors to that too, and make it 1, just to be extra safe. And in cases where you're not losing something from that shift, that makes a lot of sense to do. Again, in kind of situations where the decision is more clear, that makes sense. But in decisions where there's lots of uncertainty, maybe disagreement about the effectiveness of those risk management options, moving that line to the left, you end up potentially leaving a lot of benefit on the table, in that you're moving down to a level that is lower than what it needs to be. And so you're not accruing the benefit from the things in that gap. So there's a potential to leave benefit on the table when you take this bright line approach. The other thing that it does not do is take into account benefit. So if you have something that's just over the line but is incredibly beneficial, you would lose out on that benefit. So it doesn't take that into account. The other challenging thing is that you have to pick a level, and we've heard today this discussion in this context about where is the of concern line? What's that line that makes things of concern and not of concern? And it's really, in this context, it sounds like there's a lot of challenges with that. There's some situations where there's not challenges, where there is a clear place where you're okay with accepting the risk and where you're not. In those cases, this is a very appealing approach, but again, and being able to choose that line is an important part of being able to apply this. Another challenge is that, of course, this doesn't explicitly incorporate uncertainty that we know is present in all risk assessments. And as I mentioned earlier, the use of safety factors has been one way to take uncertainty into account, at least acknowledge the possible uncertainty, but it does, the way it's incorporated in this type of approach is, like I said, it could leave some benefit on the table. So the next model I'll talk about is I think where the folks who commissioned this study were going, and the idea of, well, we really need to take into account the benefits of the studies. That's relevant to our decision. It's not just about the level of risk, but we also want to take into account the degree to which this is providing something valuable. And of course, there's many situations in society where we are willing to accept risk for some benefit. I mean, if there weren't, we would all live in bubbles and never take cars or take planes or eat out at restaurants or anything like that. So this idea of incorporating benefit to accept risk is very common in our society. But there's a couple of challenges to this approach as well. While it does take into account this extra criteria of benefit, which is an important kind of evolution down the, getting to a more complex decision context, this criteria of benefit being acknowledged as having an important role in the decision, there are challenges here. Of course, you need to be able to express the risk and benefit in terms that are comparable across different events. Which can be challenging to be able to put them on the scale. It's also better if you can have the risk and the benefit in the same metrics, which again leads to the use of assumptions and other kinds of things that add to the complexity of interpreting the results. So for example, if you have cost in terms of dollars, but a benefit in terms of saving lives, and you have to compare those together. We know there's tools for doing that, but it adds to the kind of levels of assumptions and potential concerns about value judgments and so on that are being incorporated into the decision. So that it does add those challenges. The positives are, of course, that it does incorporate more criteria than just risk than the first example, but you need to be able to compare which the risks and benefits, which is challenging, and it does still require judgment about what's right. What is the ratio of risks to benefits that's right? So there is still this need to kind of have a place where you're willing to accept that benefit for that level of risk. So the last framework that I'll talk about is what I'm calling a deliberative criteria-based framework. And this is really based on decades of work from the National Academies, Institute of Medicine. There's a 1996 Understanding Risk report that talked about an analytic deliberative approach. My colleague in the decision analysis field, Detloff von Winterfeld, recently wrote a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academies that talked about using this kind of framework. And the idea here is that there's no bright line, there's no number that's acceptable, but that the process would include an agreement on the criteria. So you would likely have at least one, if not more, criteria related to risk and also related to benefit. So you might have different dimensions of risk and benefit that you would include, but you also could include other criteria that are important to the decision makers and important to the stakeholders, things that are more value-based than fact-based, things that have to do with controllability, which we know affect risk perception. A lot of the things that have been come up today in terms of potential things that should be taken into account in the decision process could be captured as criteria here. And then, so this would be kind of the initial work, is to decide what the criteria are so that each study that was being proposed could be evaluated on those criteria. And then those criteria would go to this analytic deliberative process with the stakeholders, decision makers, whatever the group of people that are really providing input to that. including these, observations and perceptions that would be in the criteria based on facts in the analysis results, but also including the criteria that could be more driven by values, ethical concerns, trade-offs between those criteria. So those less observable but still important factors that, that we've been hearing about today. And those criteria for each study, those values and observations would be discussed by the stakeholders, taken into account in a non-formulaic way, and a decision would be made. And then the experience from that decision would be fed back into the process, and the stakeholders would continue to make these decisions. So there's a lot of things that this approach gives us, but there's also a lot of things that it costs, right? So it's obviously much more resource intensive than the first approach. The first approach requires some setup, but then you're pretty much, good to go. You can just apply the factors and go on. The second approach has a little bit more complexity, but still relatively straightforward. This one is, in terms of the amount of resources, used to implement it and manage and oversee it and learn from it, is higher than those. So that's a trade-off. But it does allow for kind of learning and adaptation, the things that we've talked about in terms of being important to include in a process like this where there's so much uncertainty and so much to learn as time goes forward. And it is a very collaborative process, and it's designed to be collaborative. And so those are the positives about it. These questions, one of the initial questions this morning was, under what conditions should this research be done? So with that kind of question in mind, you can think about what are all the criteria that might be relevant for that decision, including the analysis, of course, but also potentially taking into account other values and criteria that are important. So in conclusion, I just wanted to leave you with two kind of key takeaways from my comments. The first is that, policymaking, decision-making is a social process. It's not an analytical process. It's ideally informed by an analytical process, especially in situations like this. And of course, the analysis is very important to get right and to keep updated and to have all the right things factored into it. But the analysis itself, as was mentioned earlier, is not going to give you the answer. We need a process that's really going to help you take that analysis, incorporate all the things that are important, and lead to a decision. And the second thing I would mention, and this kind of follows on a little bit what Rocco was talking about in terms of the resources invested. I would argue that the decision framework, the decision rules, and the decision process that are used are just as important as the analysis. And when you think about it in terms of resources and time and attention and all the things that go into the analysis, in my experience, I was at the Food and Drug Administration for 10 years working in this risk-based decision-making world, and the focus is always on the analysis because we're scientists and we're analysts and we want to know what the numbers are. And to pull it into this kind of recognition of these decision rules are really important in terms of how this analysis is used. The decision process, the criteria included, all those things are going to have a big impact on the outcomes from this process. And so I would just argue that part of the work is just as important in terms of resources and time, and maybe more important in some ways than the analysis itself. Thank you. That's my
Thank you. Our final invited discussant is Adam Finkel from the University of Pennsylvania.
Waiting for my slides to come up, but thank you. I'm always glad to be here. There they are. And so I'm going to talk from my perspective as having been a regulatory official. I was in charge of the rulemaking divisions at OSHA in the second half of the Clinton administration, but I've also been doing work generously funded by the Sloan Foundation on synthetic biology more generally, not so much on this gain-of-function research per se. And it's always easy to follow people like Tony and Kara. Tony and I went to college together many, many years ago, and we agree completely on everything but specifics, but I certainly agree with his whole presentation. So I'm going to try and find time to make 5 major points, some of which have been made already. First, that both risk and benefit estimates ought to be balanced in rigor with each other. They should be, I believe, whenever possible, quantitative. They should be humble with respect to uncertainty. They should be explicit with respect to values. And particularly importantly, and the other 2 speakers have already said this, they should be challenged in the service of a thoughtful decision rule. Secondly, that benefit estimates need to be but can be made commensurable with risk estimates and should be communicated with the same care. I'm going to try and argue briefly that a purely risk-based prioritization system, what to be concerned about, what to regulate, what to fund, is inferior to a net benefit prioritization rule. I'll talk briefly about transparency. Baruch's session tomorrow will talk much more about that. And I'll try and introduce very briefly a much more general decision paradigm that I've been calling solution-focused assessment. In the synthetic biology area in general, and from what little I've seen just in getting ready for this presentation, this meeting, in the gain of function area, I think there are a lot of risk-like pronouncements out there, and I would say also parenthetically benefit-like pronouncements, which I'll get to. A lot of precise talk about outcomes, but very imprecise or even cavalier talk about probability. The slide on the left, showing the sort of very vague apocalyptic scenario, but with no quantitation at all. But there's also maybe less easy to understand a lot of pronouncements that are very good on probability, but kind of fuzzy and cavalier about outcome. And I'll just mention on the right-hand image here the notion that those Americans who chose to drive in roughly the year or 18 months after 9/11, 2001, that those folks who died on the highway, quote, died needlessly because they were irrational. That presupposes that the death in the plane and the death in the car accident were commensurable and identical. And they're not. I mean, the endpoint fatality is fatality, but the process that gets you there may be very different and may be very idiosyncratic person to person. So I think it's great that the Griffin report is getting to, at least trying to get to quantitation. I find it really interesting that the paper or written comments that Lynn Klotz submitted are trying to get to absolute quantitation. But you can see even from the two reports, even though one is more in a relative and one more absolute scale, that there's a considerable difference of opinion about what these probabilities are. I've seen other estimates that are even smaller, this famous 33 billion, 1 in 33 billion years estimate. But it's good, I think, that these are out there from the outset. We all know about prior examples like the NASA Space Shuttle program where there were dueling estimates of risk, but they were internal to the agency and didn't get out to the public and to the decision makers really where they belonged. But of course, dueling point estimates is really the antithesis of a thoughtful balancing of risk and uncertainty. Uncertainty is the water in which we swim, and leaving it out is really a violation of first principles. So I think here I'm going to skip over this slide. I hope we'll make them available, but this is very similar to what Kara was saying. I developed at one point a hierarchy of 9 or 10 increasingly complex decision rules ranging from sort of a pure precautionary principle, which I've always been suspicious of. It's what got us into the war in Iraq, among other things. But I'm highlighting a couple of levels in this chain where we increasingly try to both to quantify, to be thoughtful about uncertainty, but also to be thoughtful with respect to how risk always varies across the population. And if we just over-aggregate and talk about expected fatalities and don't talk about the distribution of those fatalities and the individual probabilities of harm, I think we're leaving out justice and equity. And in my view, equity is efficiency. It's hard to provide maximal net benefit if you're not thinking about the benefit to the individuals who bear it or receive it. So this is too hard to explain in the time allotted, but the little red bar here is from an old paper of mine taking issue with the dueling point estimate that Bruce Ames put out in the early 90s when the controversy about ALR, the growth hormone on apples, was raging. And he said, why worry about that? The aflatoxin in peanut butter is, quote, 18 times worse for you than the ALR in the apple juice was. Now that estimate was not untrue. true, but I showed it was within a 6 or 7 order of magnitude probability distribution, ranging on both sides of the line of equality. So this mental model that risk assessment is good for comparison, but not good for quantitation. It's like a yardstick with the markers rubbed off. It really doesn't make sense, because when uncertainties exist, which they always do, and when they're uncorrelated, which they often are, it becomes X squared as hard to compare things in the right rank order than to make a reasonable decision about one or the other. So I saw something on Rocco's slide about uncertainty canceling out, and that gives me the willies, because I think that's often not the case. Moving on to benefits quickly, again, I'm kind of a novice to synthetic biology, and even more so to gain of function, but I think we even the proponents, even the developers, don't do a very good job, maybe because they're squeamish or diffident about being advocates for their own work or their own livelihood, but we don't have a good language to talk about the tremendous benefit that these applications and products, and in your case here, these fundamental gains in knowledge can provide. So this is just a kind of a human interest slide. This is 3 pictures of our daughter in vitro, in vivo day 1, and now more recently an IVF baby. And we were fortunate enough to need IVF about 20 years after the initial flurry of concern. But if some people had gotten their way in the late 70s, people would not have been born. And what's the value of, to us it's priceless. And I think we need to do a better job of communicating without shame, without sheepishness, the tremendous upsides of some of these technologies. So getting again back to both Kara and Tony's discussions of choice being the operative term rather than sort of risk in a vacuum, I guess I would just say maybe more starkly than the others have, I think the question, is it safe, is kind of an impoverished, maybe even a vapid question. And the more useful and ambitious questions include, again, in kind of ascending order, does this experiment or application have positive net benefit? Compared to other ways to do it, does it have greater marginal net benefit than the alternatives? And then I'm going to talk at the very end, if I have time, about asking even more ambitious questions. But at this point, I want to say, putting on my former OSHA administrator's hat, boy, it seems to me that I'm glad that Rocco talked as much as he did about the real day-to-day of working in a lab and trying to do the job safer. But obviously, the application with maximal change in net benefit could still be made better still with mundane, very quotidian emphasis to basic aspects of safety in the lab. The best way to keep these things from infecting the general population is to keep them from infecting workers. And this is always the case in chemical risk assessment, nuclear. It's always the workers who bear the greatest brunt of the risk, and for whom the societal benefit could be sort of channeled through them by making them safer. So I know very little about lab safety. OSHA has been very poor in this area. It's an underfunded, overmatched agency. But we did pass a regulation in my time there in 2000 for the universal use of inherently safe needle devices in healthcare settings. It's meant to apply to labs too, but my sense is that it is not percolated very well into the lab setting. There are needle devices that self-sheathing needles and other kinds of needleless systems, and that's just one example of drilling down to where the faults occur and trying to, in the name of worker protection, but in the name of societal protection as well. Brief mention of process and transparency. My colleagues at Penn and I just finished a one-year project funded by the oil and gas regulator in the province of Alberta, looking at agencies around the world under the rubric of best in class or regulatory excellence. And one of the things we learned from stakeholders both in Alberta and around this country is that people obviously want transparency, they want access to data in the information age, but what they really want, I think, by and large, even more than that, is not just having information thrown at them, but I think the psychologists call this apparency. It's not just transparency, but it is having one's rationale and motivations be apparent. The public wants to know why, not necessarily to know what, and agencies need to do a better job. Even when they say, we disagree with the majority here, this is what we're doing, they need to say why we're doing it. I'll say one more thing and then conclude. It always bothers me, I talked to Carol a little bit about this right before we went up. I totally understand the reluctance of committees, especially committees that are getting advised by people currently in the government, to really rethink in a fundamental way the organizational paradigm. But it always concerns me to see statements like, the existing institutional arrangements are pretty darn good. Here's a little mapping of all the turf that gets mapped onto different functions, and we don't see any big gaps, so let's just improve around the margins but not tinker with the organizational structure. And I would just suggest that maybe this is an area where a more coordinated institutional structure, again, I see a tremendous possible vacuum here with the area of worker protection. But I'm not sure that these agencies who don't have a good history of communicating with each other well, don't have a good history of ceding to another turf that it owns but really can't deal with as well as another agency. So I think some thought about fundamental reorganization might be worth at least discussing. So I'll just conclude by saying this is the place, the National Academy building, where the 1983 paradigm was developed, the so-called Red Book of Risk Assessment. It's been in force for now these 30-plus years, and that paradigm is very commonsensical. It says, assess the risk first, but what's happened is that has degenerated into keep assessing the risk over and over, ad nauseum, and eventually someone will say, enough is enough, let's make a decision. Risk assessment called the Silver Book. We talked in the last chapter about a more solution-first paradigm of asking fundamental questions. What are we trying to do here? And then channel the assessment in service of being able to discriminate among choices. So my example of late has been the plastic water bottle. It has not much to do with anything with gain of function, but I think it's a good analogy. I predict with some confidence that EPA and the other agencies doing this will very gladly go on for many more years, many more decades, thinking about the plastic water bottle problem as a endocrine disruptor problem. How can we dial down the leachability of these plastics so that bisphenol A gets into the water in some acceptable concentration? They might say, as they've begun to, maybe there's some other chemical that will be less harmful. Turns out that bisphenol H may be as harmful or more. But they're not asking the more fundamental question, why is the market producing 29 billion single-use plastic water bottles with consequences for energy use, disposal, et cetera? When I was a kid, we didn't have them because we had other ways of getting our ready access to cold drinking water. I'm not saying we need to go back in the past and incentivize street corner water fountains or building water fountains, but there are other ways to get this thing that falls from the sky than to bottle it up. And unless we're willing to ask these sort of industrial policy questions, I think we're not really going to ask the good questions about gain of function research that need to be asked in a risk-benefit decision context. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, with the indulgence of my chair, we'll go to 12:45. I would ask people to come to one of the two mics. I'll alternate one by one from one mic versus the other, and we'll go until whichever comes first, no more questions, or 12:45. So, first question on this side.
Yes, thank you very much for the excellent presentations. I'm Jim Welch. I'm with the Elizabeth R. Griffin Foundation. And I love hearing risk-benefit people, and I just have a simple question. At what point does it become unacceptable that there is no national database or framework of laboratory near misses, accidents, or exposures?
Who'd like to take that?
Well, easy question with an easy, from my limited point of view, it's already unacceptable. That's something that we should have had by now. So I would urge the committee to think about that as a short-term start now.
Also, it did hamper our study quite significantly. That would have been one way to start approaching an absolute risk assessment. Hand in hand with that needs to be a no-fault reporting system, because accidents do happen and you can't disincentivize lab workers from reporting what needs to be reported.
Question on this side.
Thank you. I'm Gigi Gronval from the UPMC Center for Health Security. I'd like to comment on some of the significant data gaps that were in the RBA for not only laboratory procedures, but also human factors. This is not the only circumstance where there are these data gaps for biosafety. This has come up in some other newsworthy biological incidents for the inactivation of pathogens issues, that there just isn't a lot of data out there. And a lot of these data gaps could be really addressed by, you can imagine like a master's thesis or PhD thesis that would address a lot of these gaps. But that type of research and scholarship is not funded currently. And so to that end, I think it would be valuable if the NSAB were to recommend that in order to provide this kind of data that would be useful for the oversight of not only gain of function, but other infectious disease work, synthetic biology, et cetera, that there should be an explicit funding of this type of scholarship. One of the aspects that I find most valuable from the framework that NSAB produced, the draft framework, is that it holds the need to do infectious disease research as a value. And I agree with that, and I think it's my opinion that we should be encouraging universities and university researchers to take on infectious disease research, whether it's influenza or otherwise, other types of infectious disease work, and that we should be taking care not to further balkanize influenza work. But in order to do that, we need to give these scientists the tools that they need to be able to make their labs continually safer. And when it comes to the laboratory database, I believe the U.S. government has made a commitment to do that, to have an accident and incident database that will be coming on in the next couple of years. But more of this type of thing is certainly needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Responses from the panel? Okay. From my left side.
Piers Millett, Biosecure again. I'd like to start out by thanking Rocco for a wonderful real-time or almost real-time example of why this resilience to public health impact, or the impact of a public health response, is so important. The reconfiguring of the risk space to take into account the comparative risk between H1 and H2 influenza really demonstrated to me what we were talking about in the session before coffee. Secondly, I think there was a missed opportunity to explore opportunity costs, and we heard a little bit of those from Dr. Cox with the risk-benefit analysis, especially at the international angle. It's a shame that didn't look into questions about what impact has the moratorium or pause on research had in research in other countries. Who has started doing this? Has it increased it? Has it decreased it? Or indeed, what perception or responses might be expected from other countries around the world in response to the US deciding to either undertake gain-of-function research of concern, to regulate gain-of-function research of concern, or indeed stop gain-of-function research of concern. And finally, my reading of the risk-benefit analysis on information risks suggests strongly to me that the risks in that space are only minimal because the worst things have already been released. And that suggests that the existing system failed to identify those risks, failed to assess those risks, failed to manage those risks. And that I find quite worrying, and from that I infer that there may be other information risks emerging. Rocco mentioned perhaps transmission of coronaviruses in the future when we have a better animal model. Why would we expect the same system to do better at assessing and mitigating those risks? And more broadly, what about other information risks in biosecurity? So I would suggest that, as you just heard from Adam Finkel, that maybe the system as a whole needs to be looked at.
Thank you. Any reactions?
Well, I mean, just to the point of the information risk, when you look at the sources cited, had we done the exact same study in 2002, we would have found that the information risk for influenza would have been high. But it just turned out, as you said, about 14 or 15 dual-use studies was published between 2002 and today. So your point is well taken.
Question on this side.
I would like to follow up on the question of information.
Identify yourself, please.
Sorry?
Identify you.
Victoria Krakovna from the Future of Life Institute. So if you could elaborate why the further publication of dual-use research of concern would not pose further information hazards, and generally interested in your recommendation for like a consistent publication policy for such research. Thank you.
Any comment?
So our assessment, once again, was comparative, given that someone looking to leverage dual-use information has the choice to use whatever's already published. So in this case, if methodologies that are relatively easy to follow, relatively easy to replicate, have already been published, they could use those as opposed to others that might be published in the future that get them to the exact same end. And that's why there was a relatively low remaining information risk, because studies had been published that are actually relatively easy to replicate, much simpler than the ones published by Fouché and Kaoka, that get to a significantly dual-use state. So since an intelligent actor can just pick whatever suits them as far as their technological capabilities, and also gets them to whatever their desired end state, that's why the remaining information risk is low.
Question on this side.
So my name is Corey Meyer. I'm from Griffin Scientific, and I led the benefit assessment component of our RBA. So first I wanted to add one lesson learned from my work on the benefit assessment, and that's that simply defining phenotypic changes of concern or even types of experiments of concern does not distinguish between experiments that enhance a particular gain-of-function phenotype by generating genetic changes that do not yet exist in nature, and those that generate a phenotypic change that does exist in nature, but in a slightly different genetic context. And so an example of the latter experiment would be taking a mutation that was observed in a wild-type strain, but introducing that mutation into your favorite lab strain in order to isolate its functional consequences, and determining whether the risks associated with those two types of experiments are different is important for two reasons. So one, it gets to the definition of what counts as gain-of-function research of concern, what kind of falls into that category, but also the value of the alternative approaches, those alternative approaches that depend on characterization of wild-type viruses depends on whether that latter type of experiment constitutes gain-of-function or not. Can you confirm a hypothesis generated based on analysis of surveillance data in a laboratory or not? That determines the value of that alternative approach. So I would urge the NSABB to consider addressing that issue when they move forward and kind of refining their definition of what counts as gain-of-function research of concern. And my second comment pertains to how to compare risks and benefits. So while the benefits of gain-of-function research to public health may be able to be expressed, at least qualitatively, in similar terms as the risks, I'm not sure that's true for benefits to scientific knowledge. And so considering how to compare risks to scientific knowledge benefits is important. And secondly, when thinking about public health benefits, I want to kind of underscore that while the risks of the research are immediate and that they are occurring at the time the research is being conducted, that the benefits to public health will be realized in the future. And there's significant uncertainty in how long it will take for those benefits to be realized, because translation of basic science research into public health benefits is complex and depends on many other factors. And so what exactly are you comparing to risks? The ultimate public health benefits, the public health benefits in 5 years? How do you think about those uncertainties? Would be important to consider.
Thank you. Comments from?
I'll just say briefly on the last point, obviously there's a whole literature about discounting and time value of benefits. I would say that literature, especially with regard to very large risks and benefits to climate change literature, is beginning, I think, to move certainly towards lower discount rates. In other words, letting the future speak more loudly than we have allowed in the past. So that part, I think, is not at all intractable. It's what you said, though, about sort of the value of scientific knowledge, where the benefits may be. We can't even ask the question because we don't know what. That's a real obviously important and difficult area, but I think the necessary first step, and I would commend everybody's attention, I just saw it this morning, Professor Selgelid's white paper that's out there, has a worked example of benefits in terms of expected lives saved. I think that's really important to know. If we're talking about finding the experiment with the relatively least risk, we need to be able, at least on a order of magnitude basis, be able to compare it to what the public health benefits, whenever they accrue, might be expected to be. That's a probability times consequence issue that can be elicited from experts, and it ought to be tried, even though it's very hard to do.
Regarding the uncertainty of future benefits, though, I think the really daunting part isn't just how much to discount potential lives saved in the future due to a new drug, but to have any kind of certainty or any kind of estimate on how likely a scientific discovery is to lead to that public health benefit. That's, I think, one of the trickiest aspects of assessing this is, let's say you find new drug targets. As anyone who worked in drug discovery knows, it's the uncertainty from a new drug target to actual lives saved in any time frame is unknowable.
And it depends on what other research is done.
True, absolutely.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I was going to say there even experiments that aren't successful, you learn from them that you lead to, so how do you account for that kind of part of scientific knowledge that's contributing to something that you can't directly connect?
Sure. This side.
John Steele, Emory University. So I think you're actually answering the question I was about to ask, and that is, so Rocco, you did this great risk-benefit analysis, comparative one, but in terms of maybe absolute benefits, what we can estimate relatively well is that every 25 to 50 years a pandemic will emerge and may kill 1 million to 100 million people. So if you were advising the NSABB in terms of the risk-benefit of, as a community, not doing research that could lead to potentially ameliorating these deaths, can kind of considering those numbers be integrated into the RBA as it is, or does the NSABB have to consider that in parallel? And if it's a parallel consideration, how much weight should that be given? As an experimentalist, intuitively, I think that's a major consideration, but yeah, I'd like to know the panel's opinion.
Well, I think we were, in our initial approach to risk-benefit assessment, we weren't going to provide those data on the historical consequences of flu and coronaviruses, but the NIH asked us to include a whole chapter on exactly what the impact has been, or the consequences have been, and the frequency with which they occur. And I think that is there to provide an additional piece of evidence for the deliberations. And I think the framework explicitly recognizes that risk that we're trying to buy down by pathogen research in general. So it's an important consideration. And also, when I was talking about needing a benchmark against which to think about risk, that was explicitly in terms of the potential benefits that could be provided, which is why I think we need more than one benchmark, one for pathogens that are currently circulating. Like, I think we can accept more safety risk from working on MERS because that's still causing morbidity and mortality, and probably less from SARS, because it doesn't exist in nature anymore. It could reemerge. And then even potentially even less risk from a pathogen that's theoretical, one that we could create in the laboratory but we've never seen before in nature. So I think there needs to be a sliding scale given these potential benefits, some of which could be realized any day now because we're still suffering from them, and others are either have suffered in the past and others are theoretical.
Question on this side.
This is Megan Palmer again from the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. I first wanted to commend the Griffin scientific team for outlining specifically where there were gaps in data and how that led to uncertainties on being able to draw strong conclusions. And I wanted to thank the other panelists for also highlighting areas in both the process and the types of expertise that we solicit on these questions that may also lead to the inability to draw conclusions that have, as Adam suggested, apparency and legitimacy in the process. I wanted to second Gigi Quick-Gronvall's recommendations and requests from the board to highlight the need to address the data gaps and to cultivate a wider breadth of expertise on folks that can comment on risk analysis. I think that's critically important. But I also wanted to draw some attention to an underlying issue that also appeared in reviews ongoing around U.S. biosafety and biosecurity systems that look at what is considered sensitive information in the life sciences and our current policies around that. So I wanted to first ask Rocco if those issues and how those issues around what we deem sensitive information you saw to be an immediate risk or immediate issue with making your assessments, and what you see to be a long-term risk, and recommend to the board that they perhaps draw attention to these issues of what we consider to be sensitive information, and to what extent we'll have discussions about security in the life sciences in public as something they try and ask whether or not our current institutions are sufficient to resolve. Thank you.
Well, it's an excellent question, and it's a daunting one. You know, I mean, this problem's been thrown about for a very long time. I mean, I was involved in 2001 with the Controlling Dangerous Pathogens Working Group that was run by John Steinbrenner, and that was the central focus. How do you potentially, I don't want to say prevent, but control the publication of research with significant dual utility, especially since publication is usually the last step in disseminating the information. And it's an extreme challenge. I think the DIRC policy that was recently published begins to address it, but obviously we've seen some failings in the past, and I don't think we have enough evidence yet that the past will be much different, the future will be much different in the past as far as a lack of publication of dual-use information. I mean, as a community, we continue to be surprised that experiments get done and then published, and we notice them sometime after they're published for their significant dual utility. And so the past makes the future seem kind of bleak, but hopefully there'll be further work done on controlling that, because as our tools get more and more powerful, potentially the dual utility could increase.
In the interest of time, I can just take one more question from this mic. I apologize to everybody in line.
Thank you. Mark Lipsitch from Harvard Chan School of Public Health. I think the focus on net benefits or unique benefits of this research compared to GOF of concern compared to alternatives that would be otherwise engaged in is crucial, and risks getting lost in this discussion. The fact that gain of function of concern research can find us certain scientific findings implies neither that those scientific findings can only be found by gain of function of concern research rather than other methods, nor that that those scientific findings have immediate public health benefits. My comments spoken and written at the last NSABB go into this in much more detail, but I would just mention that every single one of the mutations and phenotypes that have been identified through at least the two best known of the gain of function of concern experiments had been previously identified and noticed as phenotypes or mutations of concern in safe experiments done prior to these gain-of-function work. So the confirmation that they all were important in those same, in the gain-of-function context was new, but their identification and their utility, whatever that utility is, unproven so far for public health prediction, was there already. So the net benefit for public health is much smaller than the net knowledge.
Thank you. Any responses?
Well, I think one of the more interesting and data-driven aspects of the project was in the benefits assessment, where Dr. Meyer and my other colleagues collected data from stakeholders, the translators of the research, not just theoretically how could some of the experiments, since experimental data, be used, but what is done today. What do people actually use? How do they make their decisions? How does it feed into their framework? So understanding exactly how work is done was an important piece of data on how scientific information is used to guide decisions in public health and medicine. And I commend people who are interested in that question to read that part of the benefits assessment.
Chuck, I'll just say I totally agree. I hope it's not lost in, again, I'm novice to this particular set of discussions, and so I'm not saying anything pejorative about what's happened before here, but I will say I've seen many other arenas where there is sort of good invocation of these more common sense principles that it shouldn't just be worst things first, worst risks first. It has to be done in a comparative context, and then it's sort of relegated to a chapter that says all right things, but then ultimately people fall back on even the very term of concern. You've got to come up with an acronym or something that's pithy, but concern is relative to what? To me, it's of concern if something is imposing risk where something could be reaping the same benefit with much less risk. That's the concern. It's not the size of the risk in isolation.
Okay, let me thank the entire panel and the audience commenters. I believe lunch is out there, and the session will resume back at 1:45.